Okay, so at the end of the last video, I left off talking about how black men are disqualified by society from victimhood. So much so that when we're literally the subject of a freaking public lynching, half the country turns into pro bono private eyes for no other reason than to justify both our death and their overwhelming sense of self-loathing over their own failure to even match the personal achievements of their black peers, despite those same peers being handicapped by a system that was literally designed to ensure that white folks will come out ahead of us, no matter how inept or unremarkable they truly are at life. But yeah, this is true of black men and boys not only when it comes to violence, but sexuality as well. Remember how I said that a few of my homeboys and my cousins even got their cherries popped by much older women, some of whom were actually paid to do so? Yeah, that wasn't a setup to a bad punchline, folks. A lot of black boys, especially those who come from where I come from, are indoctrinated with a sense of masculinity so toxic that our elders will literally facilitate our grooming and abuse in order to make a man out of us. Because remember, kids, nothing says manhood like a burner before your 18th birthday. That story that Wheezy tells about Birdman paying a much older woman to pop his 11-year-old cherry while Birdman and his brother watched, or Boozy paying a much older woman to give neck to his 12-year-old, that's not uncommon by a long shot, to the point that when I heard those stories, my instant gut reaction was something along the lines of, y'all, is it prom season already? Like, Jesus, it was just freaking Christmas. Like, look at this, y'all. This boy is literally a boy. He's a minor. He's 17 years old at the time of this video being shot. Like, the only reason they're not actually in the club filming is because he's not old enough to get in. Like, this is grooming, folks. And it's transparent at that. And it's also extremely gross. But niggas still celebrate it, even fetishize it. Because again, we're overcompensating for something the white man said we were incapable of attaining in the first place. Like, if I had $1 for every time I heard some version of, well, you know, bucko, you can't get raped if you're hard growing up, I'd have bought a McMansion by now, because that's literally what some weak-minded folks actually believe. And what makes it even worse is if you're not hard, it either means you're gay or there's something else wrong with you. So not only do you get victimized, but you get clowned for not enjoying the victimization as well. And this, folks, is a big reason why 1 in 6 American men report being victims of sexual abuse as children. But perhaps more harrowing than that is, like I said in the last video, black people are always overrepresented as victims of abuse of all kinds. In addition to the fact that black folks, boys especially, underreport sexual abuse against themselves. So this is what we know, that again, 1 in 6 men report being abused as children. And again, based on what I said in the last video about attitudes within the culture on masculinity, this leads to black men and boys underreporting on top of black folks in general underreporting. Based on all of this, we can assume that a disproportionate number of that 16% of American men is black or indigenous. And that, folks, is one of, if not the most disgusting aspect of black culture. That as communal a people as we are, we will go out of our way to protect each other from the oppressor, but not nearly as far from each other. Matter of fact, we're more likely to chastise the victim for jeopardizing the sanctity of the community with their accusation than we are to bring the accused before the tribunal, I guess if you want to call it, for punishment, or at least for acknowledgement of the crime. Matter of fact, we'll blame the victim for not stopping the act or even bringing it upon themselves somehow, instead of, again, going after the abuser. The only real exception I can think of is when it's a man accused of abusing a boy. And even then, it's not because of the abuse that the accused is brought before the village elders, I guess if you want to call it in this case, but because he imposed his own taboo sexuality onto a boy, and thus he runs the risk of jeopardizing that boy's ability to mature into a traditionally hegemonic masculine man, because duh nigga, that's how sexuality works. I mean, it's science, for Jesus Christ's sake. And the wildest part of all of this is that our apparent inability to accept sexual victimization, especially within community, is a direct result of the hypersexual identity that white people imposed on us. This I talked about in I don't know how many videos ago. And because this and our musicality were the only qualities attributed to black folks that could be spun into a positive somehow, we adopted that hypersexualness as a form of desirability. And the rest of the world followed suit to the point of spinning the block right back to dehumanization. But the question needs to be asked, then what happens when the object of that desire, again, is a fucking child? Well, I happen. Yeah, so I'm not even going to beat around the bush with this. As a child, I was... God damn, I did not think that this would be this hard to talk about. Okay. Give me 5, Clarence. I know you're not really there, but whatever. I'm just going to pretend that there's a nigga in the room with me right now. So, yeah, like I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted by that sudden onslaught of emotion, I was a sexual abuse victim as a child. And I, like a lot of black boys and men, struggled to process that. And as a result, many of us either keep that trauma bottled up for perpetuity or, like me, dissociate from the memory for years, sometimes decades even. And this is at least in part because, like I said, no one believes in black on black sex abuse unless that belief is based in homophobia. Again, women can't rape a man unless either she does butt stuff to him or he's gay. In which case, the problem isn't the abuse, but it's the fact that you didn't enjoy it, you little fruitcake. Well, bucko, my own experience begs to differ because my abuser was actually a woman. And see, this is something that I keep trying to get across in these videos. All of my thoughts on politics, culture, blackness, basically anything is informed not by the books I've read, but what my own 2 eyes and ears have seen and heard. What I've read just serves to contextualize what my own life experience has taught me, which in this context of this video is that none of you dry dick red pill woman haters give a flying about boys like me until you see a chance to use our story to justify your own misogynoir. So from the bottom of my heart, please eat a dick and choke to death on it along with your deadbeat surrogate godfather over here, bucko. Die mad. Even bigger rock many black women find themselves in when their partner is revealed to be an abuser. So I'm not a tabloid or a rap blog that's run out of a call center in Mumbai somewhere. So I'm not going to dwell on the case itself or any of the surrounding drama. If y'all really wanted to know the true story, y'all would have Googled it by now. But what's important to remember is that Meg did lie. To protect Tory, you freaking numbskulls. I don't understand why this is so hard for y'all to comprehend. She was protecting him from being punished too harshly by the system, which I mean is pretty standard for IPV victims, to be honest. And because Misogynoir, when Meg got subpoenaed to testify against Tory Piano Teeth over here, every rap blog and Twitter account on the planet went about spamming any and every piece of dirt on Meg that they could find. Half of it not even being fact checked, and the other half having absolutely nothing to do with the case itself, because lame niggas and their pick-me nigget sidekicks desperate for male approval were going to eat that ish up like all day Sunday pasta. The best kind, in fact. Except if you get it from Cheesecake Factory. That's just, well, don't do that. So my point is, part of the reason a lot of black women find it so difficult to love black men is because they don't feel safe with or around us. Worse yet, they can't trust the community to protect them if and when their partner fails to do so. Or, if we're going to keep it a buck, is the primary facilitator of their abuse. And fellas, like I keep saying, the numbers back up what I'm saying. Am I saying that black men need to be divested from altogether? No, and that section of black relationship discourse is so small and insignificant that there's no point in even bringing them up. Like, I think even I have more subs at this moment than the biggest divester channel on YouTube. But what I am saying is, sitting here and pretending like black intracommunal violence is a negligible occurrence is disingenuous at best. And to be honest, the reason a lot of us don't want to acknowledge it is the same reason them tight shirt niggas took issue with Umar saying the quiet part about black men out loud a few weeks ago.
We as black men are not raising black boys to be the men that our women need. We are not. They out there killing themselves right now. What we doing about it? Unemployed black males, what we doing about it? Pants sagging, weed smoking, what we doing about it? Black men are not raising black boys to be the men our community needs. That is 100% our fault.
Now, if y'all just skip past the clip, because, I mean, Umar is basically a living meme at this point, he actually makes a solid point here, which he is apt to do from time to time. What he was talking about was black men within the community playing the role of role model to young black men that they see who don't have one in place. But what he said can also go for holding ourselves and each other accountable for the harm we do to each other. And because of the reasons I spent the last video and a half giving, black women and children especially are the most vulnerable to violence within the community. Again, it's kind of hard to love someone that makes you feel unsafe. And look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I have a simple solution, because I don't. But let's not sit here and cap like black femmes don't have a reason for not letting us in the house on the first date. And no, Steve, it's not because of your bullshit 90-day rule. Now, with all of that being said, again, we have to take into account that the specific and unique intersections of oppression that black men experience living in a white supremacist society is a big reason why we're in the state that we're in now, which leads me to this point. Men are just as much prisoners of the big P as women are, even if we don't suffer to the same degree. We're prevented by societal pressure from admitting when we just can't perform the kind of masculinity that's demanded of us. And many times we are ridiculed as a result. So here's a quick little tangent. Like I've said in an earlier video, I had been kicked out of like 2 different schools within the span of like 4 or 5 years. And when I got to high school, in my first year there, we basically turned the lunchroom into a Royal Rumble every other day. So by my sophomore year, the nuns decided that they weren't having it and instituted a zero tolerance policy, which basically meant you got into one squabble and there was one-way ticket out of there. And because I, 1, didn't want to go through expulsion again, and 2, I really wasn't trying to go to the school up the block from my house that was so hood that niggas had to get jumped into the football team, I quelled my violent outburst just enough that my natural reaction to ball busting was no longer swinging on sight. And because I'm basically discount Drax, the concept of roasting went completely over my head until like the last half of my junior year. And for those of y'all who don't understand the way that roasting works, that can very easily turn into straight up bullying if you don't have a proper clapback prepared, or at least someone in your corner willing to clap back on your behalf, which I didn't always have. But I did have these hands, and I used them until I couldn't. But when I did use them, they were very effective. And because I just refused to react, I was perceived as being weak, effeminate even, which, I mean, did kind of serve me well once I got out of the hood and started going to college in the suburbs. But for the time being, it made me a target, not just to my male peers, but female ones as well. See, the wild thing is both of the girls who bullied me at different points during high school actually liked me, due in part to those effeminate traits I mentioned earlier. See, what some folk perceived as weakness, they perceived as gentleness. And yeah, for all of you niggas who think you're single because you're not tough enough, most women actually prefer a gentleman to a roughneck, despite what MC Light says. See, the issue is gender norms dictated that the roughneck niggas were the boys that they were supposed to be attracted to. They were strong, brash, and domineering. The kind of boys who had the potential to grow into the men that media and their environment told them were ideal. Again, in the black community, especially the more impoverished you are, superficial, even stereotypical masculine traits are aggrandized because of our limited access to wealth and thus the means to fulfill the traditional male roles of protector and provider. See, it's understood that J-Rock from up the block is probably going to have a harder time providing than someone with a 4-year degree or whatever. So we don't put as much of that burden of manhood on him, so long as he's able to project his masculinities in ways he can control. So yeah, a lot of women desire hyper-masculine men for no other real reason than because they've learned to desire that kind of man. And that was the case with the two girls I mentioned earlier. But the truth was, they didn't really want any of those boys. Who they wanted was me, because I wasn't a roughneck. Or at least I didn't give the appearance of one. But they couldn't let anybody else know that, or they'd have been clowned just as bad as I was. Matter of fact, remember the girl that I said gave me a mid-class lap dance in 11th grade? Yeah, she was one of those bullies. The worst of the two, in fact. And yeah, for those of y'all wondering, no, I didn't promptly escort her under the bleachers for a brief anatomy lesson. I froze. And as you expect, I got clowned for that as well. Even by my own friends. Because remember, cishet boys and men can't be sexually assaulted by conventionally attractive women. Just doesn't happen. Again, never mind the fact that this girl has spent the better part of the past 2 years doing everything in her power to make me hate her. The girl with the biggest booty in our class just pantomimed back shots with me, and I didn't even give that thing a slap.
Nigga, you gay.
Now, because I feel like I've done more than enough trauma dumping in this video, I'm not going to elaborate, but this has been a thing that has followed me basically my entire boyhood. Did I just hit this mic? What the? I've been accused of being gay in one way, shape, or form for no other reason than my constitution, even by some of you dry dick niggas in the comments. I don't know. Maybe if you embraced your feminine side, then you would get your dick wet every once in a while. But hey, it's none of my business, bucko. And this was for no other reason than because I wanted an easy bake oven instead of boy toys for Christmas growing up. Because I'd rather do things like stay in the house and read books than ride bikes with friends, because I'd rather play PlayStation than Pop Warner football. Like, I kid you not, there was a very brief moment in time where I genuinely thought that I might be gay by virtue of Pygmalion effect alone. But then I remembered that I didn't like boys. But that's the price you pay as a boy for not performing traditional masculinity, or at least not performing it the right way. Now, like I said, this did wind up kind of serving me well when I got older, because go figure, girls actually like guys with a touch of sugar in their tank. But growing up, my peers and my parents did not approve of my apparent inability to conform to traditional masculine standards. See, because once I did go off to college, all of those gay tendencies of mine, like how y'all notice I use my hands in my head to emote a lot, or how I physically cannot stop myself from singing every Disney villain song with my whole chest when they come on, or how I wore hair curlers to bed for like the first 6 weeks away from home before I just said, F it, I'm gonna just do a wash and go and call it a day, were what made me attractive to a lot of the women that I was now around. What I learned by getting away from home was that desirability for a lot of people, especially when they're too young to even know what they really like, is dictated as much, if not more so, by external than internal factors. Like 20 years ago, most mainstream publications would have called this plus size. How do I know this? Exactly. Same goes for men. Like, look at the way Wolverine's body has changed since X1. And he's still not comic book accurate. My point is, so what if you don't meet generally accepted standards of masculinity? Because I promise you, those standards are probably going to change in like 5 or 10 years anyway. Because I'm telling you from experience, what one person may think is soft is the same thing that'll have you and someone else in the campus infirmary praying to God that it's only a UTI. Which it was, for the record. But I know that's not going to be good enough for some of y'all, because you're going to die on that as a man type hill that your grandparents got divorced on. And yes, folks, there is a reason why your Pop and Meemaw caught strays just now, because here's the thing about this gender war garbage that pollutes Black Twitter. The people who are pushing that, like the ones who really believe it and aren't just grifting it because they lack literally any other aptitude whatsoever, a lot of that isn't really based on organic preferences. They picked up their ideas from their parents or their grandparents or some other Black elder. And those folks more than likely picked that up from the church at some point, which historically has been one of, if not the biggest agent of white supremacist propaganda and policy. Just like I said in the liberation theology video. Segue.
Jesus Christ is my nigga. He's the son of the original G.
Now, I don't want to get too deep into theology here in this video because this is not that channel, but just know that when I use the term church in the context of this video, I'm talking about the physical institution of church and not the theological definition, but whatever. See, the irony of Black church culture is, as unapologetically Black as it is still steeped in white supremacy, which is why a not insignificant portion of Black Christians, even within Black church culture, which is separate and unique from general Western Christianity, mind you, actively deny the blatant Blackness of the religion, even though I did a whole half-hour video on how Black people basically invented contemporary Christianity. So yeah, you can thank niggas for Hillsong. Actually, don't thank us for that. But forget I even said anything. But anyway, the greater irony to me is how much Black church Christians respect, even revere institutions like the NOI, to the point that church niggas will regularly quote Farrakhan from the pulpit, despite practicing what's basically just Judaism for hipsters and lazy people. Like, if I had $1 for every time I heard church leadership waxing on about how Muslims do biblical manhood better than the Bible readers, I could buy 2 McMansions. And yeah, I used that joke already, but shut up and make your own video if you have a problem. But here's the thing. 9 times out of 10, when you hear church folk say Muslim or Islam, what they really mean is the NOI, and the NOI exclusively. And that's because black church culture is a lot closer to that than it is to biblical Christianity, to be honest. Now, again, this isn't me doing Christian apologetics. I'm just trying to get y'all to understand why black church culture is so contradictory and proud of it at that. And one of the first videos I did on this channel, I talked about how capitalism has replaced Christianity as Western culture's religion of choice. And I heavily relied on Feuerbach and Durkheim's thoughts on religion to do so. TLDR, what I argued was that people who adhere to an organized or communal religious tradition don't worship God so much as they use God as a proxy to worship the values and ideals they hold sacred. Thus, organized religion is basically just self-worship with more steps. And fringe identity movements like the NOI and 5%ers, which every part of my non-black audience has no clue exist, apparently, skip the whole proxy part and step 10 toes down into self-divination.
Man is the original man. He's the absolute from which all others come. He's the first and he is the last. He is the maker and the owner of the universe. And from him all others come. Brown, yellow, red, and white. Talk to us, brother.
Like I've said in past videos, the purpose of those fringe identity movements historically has been to empower black people, men specifically, within the confines of a white supremacist society. But the issue is that because of our modern understanding of race was always just a justification for white supremacy in the first place, which I also spent almost an hour talking about, by accepting that any race is inherently superior to another and therefore accepting race as biological, you've basically made white supremacy the template of whatever ideology you've built. Damn it, Yakub strikes again. So what is my point with all of this? Well, that the reason why black church Christians, especially those in leadership, hold fringe identity movements like the NOI in such high esteem, despite them niggas clowning us regularly, is because we're practically speaking the same thing. As most of y'all have not hesitated to comment in past videos, the church has historically been one of, if not the primary facilitators of white supremacy, which I just said like 2 minutes ago. Whatever. Now, I've also said in the past that all theology is subjective. Thus, within the same Bible that white folks found a half-assed, roundabout means to justify our oppression, black folks saw liberation. But the caveat is we really only saw it for black men. So we didn't adopt biblical Christianity either. Rather, we adopted the white man's religion, but replaced white with black, and thus became just as bad at perpetrating patriarchy as the whites were. Or I guess we became just as good. Whatever, this script is so screwed up or whatever, and it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. Screw y'all. Black denominations are notoriously misogynistic to the point that the biggest ones just started ordaining women to positions of power within like the last 5 years. And even then, those women are exceptions to the way women are perceived within those denominations. Like, I should know, I grew up Pentecostal, oneness Pentecostal at that. So yeah, up until maybe like a decade ago, I would regularly hear black church BS like a woman not being allowed to legally separate from her abusive or unfaithful spouse until that spouse chose to do so first. And even then, many ministers would still refuse to officiate the woman's second marriage because she's still married according to the Bible. Now, admittedly, this isn't nearly as common now because divorce isn't stigmatized the same way it once was in black church culture. Because, I mean, let's keep it a buck. The leadership was usually the main offenders in the first place. But it is still frowned upon, especially if and when a woman initiates. For the sake of brevity, I won't get into all the hoops and hurdles that black churchgoers jump through to justify misogyny. But the irony is that the early Pentecostals were ridiculed and relegated to the fringes of Christendom, not because of the communal, spontaneous, and uncouth nature of the worship, but primarily because of the race mixing and women not only preaching but occupying leadership roles within the nascent denomination. So basically for practicing biblical Christianity. Now, I do want to extend a bit of grace to the early black church leaders because you got to understand they were more likely to get lynched and get a proper lecture at a proper seminary. So a lot of their exegesis was flawed at best. That being said, we got to keep it a buck. A lot of that misexegesis was done, whether consciously or not, to justify patriarchy within black households. Again, you got to understand black women have always made up a significant portion of the workforce because the majority of black households would not and still cannot survive without two incomes. So then what happens when hubby loses his job because of the foreman's fear of his wife catching a case of the jungle fever after seeing all of that sweaty black man meat? And now wifey is the primary breadwinner of the black household. How then do you justify patriarchy if and when a man is rendered unable to fulfill his duty to provide for his household? God said, that's how, nigga. Okay, so again, because I don't want this video to spend too much time on theology, I'll just give y'all a quick and dirty example of how badly exegeted a lot of black church theology is. Okay, so any of y'all who grew up in church like I did are probably familiar with Deuteronomy 28, right? Or at least the first 15 verses. For those of y'all who aren't, it's colloquially known as God's blessing plan. The way that it works is pretty much that if you obey all of God's commandments, then you'll never lose on a scratch off or something, whatever. The problem is that Deuteronomy, matter of fact, the entirety of the Old Testament wasn't written with anyone but Hebrews in mind. Thus, why, in order to activate the blessing plan, you have to keep all 630 something commandments of the Mosaic Law, not just the 10 that Charlton Heston gave us. In other words, Gentiles are not included in the Mosaic covenant, except the ones that convert to Judaism. And to really drive this point home, according to Christian theology, Jesus's birth, death, and resurrection initiated what the prophet Jeremiah called the new covenant. In other words, the thing that makes going to heaven possible in the first place. But more important for our story, it nullified any previous contracts God made with humans, including the Mosaic one, and its accompanying blessing plan. Like, Paul literally wrote an entire letter about this, but I guess we just skipped that part because the offering plate was looking a little too sparse for our liking that day, huh? And speaking of Paul, look, I know some of y'all anti-theists and hardcore conservative Christians alike will point to those epistles as support for your stance or whatever. And yeah, Paul's letters are peppered with a bit of casual misogyny and homophobia. But again, context is key when it comes to exegesis. First of all, remember, Paul was a Pharisee in his former life. Like the most socially conservative of first century Jews. Literally, these were Jesus's biggest ops during his earthly ministry, if you don't remember. Matter of fact, Paul was on his way to go clap some Christians when he came to Christ in the first place. Like, it would basically be like if Uncle Clarence himself, no relation, went to the Potter's house to hand deliver a cease and desist notice to TD Jakes, but caught the Holy Ghost instead. And the next week wound up being installed as a Kojic bishop, which, when I think about it, is actually not far from the way that works, honestly. But my point is, it doesn't matter how life-changing his come to Jesus moment would be. There's no way a nigga like Clarence is just going to drop his cooning cold turkey overnight. What I'm saying is, it's bad exegesis to completely discount Paul's background when studying his work. Like, I mean, it's like making capital the basis of your entire ideology, nay, personality, without knowing that Marx was an anti-Semitic day trading debate bro. Again, die mad. Also, putting aside the historical and cultural context for a moment, these letters were never really meant to address anything or anyone other than the Christian communities to which they were sent. Like, the names of the churches are literally in the titles of the books for Black Jesus' sake. And the ones that were addressed to people weren't meant for anyone's eyes but the person to whom they were addressed, which was 9 times out of 10, a church leader experiencing some kind of cataclysmic crisis within that church. It would be like if 2,000 years from now, somebody based an entire denomination on the leaked SBC emails about the rampant sexual abuse in that denomination and the subsequent cover-up of it. Oh, y'all didn't know about that? Well, maybe, you know, if we cared as much about actual sex predators as we do protecting cishet fragility, I wouldn't have to make a half-hearted joke about it just to draw your attention to your youth pastor's fisting fetish. Not only that, but to insist that what Paul says in Titus or anything he writes to Timothy or to the Corinthian church not only justifies patriarchy, but women remaining silent in church not only contradicts Paul's other letters that literally salute and commend specific women in early church leadership, but the First Corinthian letter itself, which has a whole freaking chapter dedicated to proper attire for women and men when addressing the congregation. What I'm saying is those passages are either thoughtlessly misrepresented to promote modern sensibilities on gender roles, or they were added after the fact due to the same thing, or sometimes both, honestly. And if I had time, I would unpack the homophobia as well. But TLDR, again, if you know the context of how a lot of Roman men practice homosexuality, then that line in Romans about men becoming lovers of themselves or whatever reads less like a divine condemnation than it does like that boy lovers quote from 300. Again, if y'all really want to know what actual biblical man and womanhood is without spending hours of your life doing apologetics like me because you actually have something better to do with your time, there's plenty of scholarly research out there. I'll even suggest taking a look at The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr. I don't quite remember. If I got the name wrong, I'll put it up on the screen. If not, it means that I did a bingo. But my point is to point out the irony of church folk weeping and gnashing teeth over modern sensibilities diluting their doctrine, when if you really knew your Bible the way you thought you did when you got that Sunday school completion certificate, then you would know that what you call modern is just church culture coming full circle. But you don't know that, because the bar for entry into Black church ministry is so low that Chuck could probably jump over it, even in his advanced age. Basically, all you need today are a couple of catchy couplets preached in a sing-songy cadence to be considered anointed according to Black church culture, when the majority of denominations, including most Black Baptist orgs and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, require that you at least spend 2 years in seminary to become an ordained minister, and it can take up to like 10 for you to be qualified enough for your own church. But again, because Black folks have historically been denied access to seminaries or equivalent education, as long as you know who fought the Battle of Jericho, you're pretty much golden in Black church ministry. It's for this reason that niggas can go from drug dealers to deacons and pimps to preachers in a matter of literal weeks and then wind up right back in the streets before that year's watch night service. But a woman who's been busting her behind for the church for decades tops out as president of the Junior Missionary Board or whatever. Like, I get the logic, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. We give men these roles even when they aren't at all qualified. One, to empower them in a society that goes out of its way to take power away from them. And two, to attract men to a culture that is disproportionately female. But again, why is that so important to Black church culture, for men to not just be a part of it, but to take lead in it? Mother flipping patriarchy. That's why. See, the thing that a lot of Black church old heads fail to understand about their own religion is that it is at its core antithetical to hegemonic manhood. According to traditional standards of masculinity, Jesus would be about as manly as Miss B Nasty and not nearly as worth following. The man spent the entirety of his earthly ministry jobless, homeless, and in the company of women that he wasn't related to? How scandalous, according to first century Judeo-Roman standards. He preached things like empathy, compassion, pacifism even. Well, I mean, most times he did. Like, he basically told people it would be better for them to gouge their own eyes out than to sexualize a woman that wasn't their mate. He absolved a woman who had allegedly been caught in the act of adultery, when in that day that was a crime punishable by death, even though, I mean, the way y'all treat unfaithful women these days online might be worse than whatever she was going to get. The first two people he appeared to upon his resurrecting from the dead were his mom and his alleged side piece, if you're into conspiracy theories and trash fiction. Even when speaking on divorce, Jesus speaks exclusively on the man's role, saying that it was because of the men that Moses even made divorce legal in their society in the first place. And if a divorced woman remarrying was a sin, then it was the man's fault for divorcing her in the first place, because Jewish women back then basically had no rights, least of which the right to divorce their spouse. And a man could pretty much divorce his wife for something as petty as burning the babka. I don't even think that Jewish people were making babka back then. Whatever, bad joke, moving on. Not to mention, Jesus was sassy as hell. Like, actually read some of the conversations he has, not with his ops, but with his disciples, the men specifically. Like, you can practically hear the holy rolling of the eyes to the back of his head. What I'm saying is, patriarchy is incompatible with Christianity as it was practiced in the first few centuries of its existence, as are any other concepts of domination, including racism, capitalism, etc. So yeah, men who feel it's their right to dominate are more likely to gravitate toward a religion, or better yet, a cult that tells them that. Duh. And even with that, I always thought it was kind of goofy to use the NOI as the bar for church attendance when there's only like 50,000 active NOI members today. Like, even the smallest Black denominations that actually matter enough to be worth mentioning have at least 100,000 plus members on the roll. The reason that number feels so small, though, is because, like I just alluded to, there's just way too many churches in the wild. And again, this is all because we insist on telling men that it's not only their nature, but it's their right to lead, even when they've proven time and time again that they're incapable of doing so. Like, if you tell a person that so many times, they're not only going to believe it, but they're going to act out upon it. So why then should I, as a man in a church, be limited to leading an auxiliary of like 4 or 5 folk when I can literally just start a whole church from my living room? So in addition to the church historically perpetuating white supremacy, a lot of black men are turned off from Christianity because it's just not toxic enough, believe it or not. I know that sounds freaking wild, but bear with me for a second. And the wildest part about it all is the same reason why the black church struggles to attract and retain men today is the same reason why the women far outnumbered men in the first century church. Christianity, practically speaking, is a countercultural movement, at least based on the biblical principles. And a primary part of that culture that they were rebelling against was patriarchy. Thus, why the further and longer Christianity spread in the first century, even people like Paul had no choice but to acknowledge how vital women were to its spread, which is one of the main reasons that Hoteps and Fruit of Islam cultists clown Christians in the first place. Now, listen, this isn't me saying that that is the reason black men don't go to church. Like, I would literally have to do like a whole separate video on that, and I just might not think about it. But my point is to say that black church culture, just by its nature, is more compatible with traditional femininity than it is with masculinity. I mean, nigga, look at this.
Everywhere that I go, everywhere that I go, walking on my job, walking in my house, walking in my business, walking in my school, signing up for that class. Everywhere I go, everywhere that I go, everywhere that I go, everywhere that I go, with my feet shall trod, I will possess it.
Again, men are taught practically from birth that just feeling, let alone displaying that level of emotion, is inherently feminine and therefore a sign of weakness. Additionally, like I said in the past, black church culture, due to it being very heavily influenced by African spiritualism, is much more communal than other Western Christian traditions. Again, something that men are taught to avoid. Like, why do you think there are so many non-traditionally masculine men active in church culture, despite how antagonistic that culture is to them? And the irony is, for as much as we associate femininity with weakness, instead of just owning what we're all about, a lot of us just bullshit our way into capitulating the patriarchy and doing what the Hoteps do, but in Jesus' name.
Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me and hath anointed me.
That's right.
The man is not the preacher. God must get in the man and then utilize the man, utilize the clay. That's the anointing God in the man. Can a woman preach? No.
No. Never, sir. No.
Did God ever call one?
No. That's right.
Will he ever call one? No.
Okay, so for those of y'all who don't know who this is, it's Apostle Gino Jennings, founder and leader of the First Church of Our Lord Jesus Christ, which doctrinally is a Pentecostal denomination, but in practice is basically a cult. Like, I really was not joking when I said doing what the NOI does, but in Jesus' name. I mean, everything aside from the criminal activity that is, but we not going to get into that. Gino is basically the black church equivalent of a debate bro, and I'm not even joking about that. The bulk of his sermons are either hours-long diatribes on why every other denomination aside from his own is heretical, or actual literal debates. But if you ask me, none of that is what makes Gino so popular, to be honest.
You so-called Christian-looking whores, jumping in some church, flapping your ankle chains around, all on the choir, breasts hanging out, lips all red, nails painted red, purple, blue, green, long like bird claws, all this fake hair, breast implants, toenails painted with little fake diamonds in it. Your toes ain't richer. You're nothing but a prostitute.
Amen.
Yeah, man. Go ahead, go to church now. Go to church. Got nothing but a singing hoe, a shouting hoe, a organ playing hoe, a choir director hoe. Hey, preacher. If what I just said describe your wife, you're married to a hoe. Amen. Am I right, I said? Talk to me.
See, whether you agree with Gino's doctrine or not is aside from the point. He regularly uses misogynistic rhetoric like this in his sermons, which not only attracts equally misogynistic men, but women playing pick-me to misogyny for the sake of a mate or their own self-hate or whatever. So a lot of black churchmen, even if they aren't members of Gino's church, embrace Gino's teachings for no reason than because he speaks in a language that they can understand. And it's wild because even hoteps don't mess with Gino like that. Matter of fact, his beef with them runs so deep that NOI niggas literally pulled up at his HQ one time and pulled the whole "brother, can I speak to you for a minute" thing before things eventually de-escalated.
What's your name, brother? My brother Baker. You brother Baker.
And Gino is not by any stretch the only culprit. Juanita Bynum, Vodi Bakum are the first people I think of. Matter of fact, Juanita is probably worse, but she's able to get away with it for the same reasons right-wing redneck spam, box perm bandit, and Thomas the Terrible lineup when we say that they don't listen to black people. My point with all of that was to say, no, we don't need to be more like the NOI, and I'm so sick to death of hearing that BS. But in all seriousness, is to make the point that a lot of y'all's ideas of man and womanhood come from the elders, or at least the culture of the elders. And the culture's ideas of those things comes directly from the church. And the church got it from not the Bible, but from white people. The same white people who used that same Bible to tell us we would never be worth more than the number of cotton bales that we could pick in a day. So when you do go on your tweet storms about high-value men and any other Kevin Samuels-approved skullduggery, or when you thinly veil your homophobia by using the word sassy as a placeholder for the F-slur, or when you want to go on some BS rant about settling for average men without even skimming through the societal factors that lead to black men underperforming scholastically and financially, and then justify that BS as people not wanting to hear the truth, that's not even the truth until it finds its way to the Breakfast Club, you're reinforcing the very constructs and their ideas that kept us, man and woman, enslaved, and that's still keeping us oppressed today. So my point is, you using your blunt force head trauma of a podcast to promote the white man's masculinity is exactly what makes it so hard for black men to love and be loved in the first place. So please, for the love of black Jesus, abolish these freaking podcasts already. I just hit the microphone again. What the
It doesn't have to be the way it is. You say it is just because for the past 20 years, every day it is.
See, the thing that a lot of y'all who wax poetic about your parents and grandparents' decades-long marriages that you forget is that many of them were loveless at best and dangerous at worst, which is why a ton of people are just abstaining from marriage altogether now, and also why divorce rates for people 65 and older are at historic highs. But the question is, why are so many black men so unwilling to change to the point that they will literally leave the country for some coochie instead of just doing some introspection and saving a few racks and a lot more dignity? Well, performance. See, even if we choose to change as individuals, that doesn't mean the society around us will. Matter of fact, based on the way we're conditioned to understand manhood, society will punish us if we try to change. Going back to what I said earlier about dominance, black men feel a need to show to not only their loved ones but their peers that they not only wear the pants but their drawers are bolted on to their waist, and that sounds extremely uncomfortable if I'm gonna be real. We don't want to be perceived by our peers as being henpecked or whipped or simping for our SOs, so we go out of our way to assert both dominance over them and autonomy from them. And part of our autonomy is expressed a lot of times through aversion to commitment. And this I'm speaking on from experience. Again, women are conditioned to make themselves as desirable for a man as possible, to the extent that that man will willingly sacrifice his autonomy to be with her. And if she can't get him to do that, it's not due to any failure on his part, but it's something she's not doing right to keep him with her and out of the arms of another woman. In short, men are conditioned to expect our cake and eat it too. And black men are further enabled to behave as such due to historical black emasculation by white supremacist social structures, our desire to overcompensate for that, and black women's attempts to help us overcome that emasculation, which often manifests as brushing aside the harm we do to them as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the community. My point is, the reason loving black men is a challenge is the same reason loving a man in general is. Patriarchy. There, I said it. So y'all can go ahead and have a fit in the comments now. However, the intersections of patriarchy and white supremacy have created a condition where black men and women, if we're going to be real here, overemphasize the importance of traditional masculine functions while still being denied adequate access to the tools needed to fulfill those, thus creating a community that not only enables but encourages hyper masculinity. And the reason this is, ironically, is because of our historical lack of access to the tools needed to achieve hegemonic manhood, thus making those who did at least come close to that access the most desirable among us. This created a few consequences that we still see today. The ones with access use that as an excuse to exercise dominance over their partners. And were never challenged on that because, one, the supply of gainfully employed men was so low and their partners weren't really in the place where they could survive without them most times. And B, the historical oppression and emasculation of black men by white supremacy and its institutions pressured black women to keep black men lifted even at their own expense, because the logic then and even now a lot of times, depending on who you talk to, admittedly, is that the man must be the head in order for the body to live and thrive, even if just figuratively. Furthermore, this lack of access and simultaneous pressure to achieve hegemonic manhood caused black men to embrace hypermasculinity as our standard to the point of toxicity. Thus, we're conditioned to be effectively a community of black Johnny Bravos. And y'all can't tell me that that show wouldn't slap if it were real. As much as I've tried to reduce this thing, any analysis I make is going to be reductive, because I mean, for as true as everything I said is, black men are by no means a lost cause or as hard to love as many say we are, or as some make themselves. We're statistically still the most active fathers of all racial demographics, regardless of our marital status. And we still overwhelmingly marry black women, regardless of education or income level, especially when compared to, for the sake of argument, Asian women and Latinos of any gender identification. That being said, gender war discourse exists for a reason. I mean, the reasons are clout and clickbait, but there's a reason people have made whole careers exploiting the discourse, and that's because there are a few kernels of truth in there somewhere. What I'm saying is we can start the healing process by first stop seizing every opportunity to project our own experiences onto each other. Unlearn what white supremacy taught us a man and manhood are supposed to be, and do better accordingly. Admittedly, these are tasks much easier said than done, and I'm a living witness it won't happen overnight or over a year even, depending on how indoctrinated you are. But it is necessary to becoming the best version of yourself you possibly can be. Not just for the people who love you, but for your own sake, bucko. And for those of you who have decided to love a black man and are wondering, well, how can I help him be the best man he can possibly be? Well, honestly, it starts first with you falling out of love with his manhood and in love with his maleness. And yes, that was meant to be a double entendre. No, it wasn't, but just let me have that. What I mean is learn to love him not for the things he does, but for the person he is. So basically anything he does that doesn't require cash or credit is what I'm saying. Or also throwing hands. Y'all get what I'm trying to get at here. In short, make him feel safe to feel vulnerable. That's about the most you can do, because change is a choice. Trust me, if he cares about you that deeply, he'll at least try. And if he doesn't, then maybe it's time for you to hit the brakes. I'm just keeping a buck. I mean, that's one lesson that you can learn from this guy after all. All right, just so that y'all understand that I'm trying to be as objective as possible here, let me use a contemporary example of what I mean by patriarchy going both ways. Okay, so obviously this ain't that type of channel, but remember that Keke Palmer drama from a few weeks ago? Look, if you want to clown the nigga for, I guess, expecting his baby mother to behave like a wife or something or whatever, even though Keke is not his wife, or if you want to clown him for not having the balls to keep his in-house drama in-house instead of low-key soliciting public support for his goofiness, or if you want to get on him for his unrelated coon adjacent takes, then by all means. But one of the main criticisms that I saw of this nigga from men and women alike was always some version of child, that man too broke to have an opinion anyway. And see, that's exactly what I mean about some of y'all only being down for dismantlement so far as it suits your own interests. This is the exact same thing that white feminists in the first, second, and fourth waves of that movement did. And we literally wrote entire books about it. But some of y'all have a tendency to still fall back on patriarchy if and when you get caught in your feelings and you can't think of a better clapback. If y'all haven't noticed, the difference between this video and the last one is that the first one was all about the individual's role in unlearning our personal idea of what manhood is. This video is about the community's role in creating that idea in the first place. Like, how are black men supposed to unlearn our miseducation when all some of y'all are going to do is throw it right back in our faces when you get aggy? Or maybe you've just given up on black men altogether already. In which case, why on God's gray earth are you even watching this video? Okay, so in the last video, I used a clip of one of those brain dead urban podcasts to illustrate how some women do base their dating preferences on a man's earning ability. And I did have another clip of that same woman that I lost, and I don't feel like finding it. But basically, the smarty YouTube version of what she says in the second clip is that society bases a man's value on his earning potential and a woman's on her ability to achieve conventional attractiveness. Therefore, the smart thing to do would be to leverage whatever amount of those things you have into power, and therefore the most desirable outcome for yourself. And I mean, she's technically not wrong about that. And this should have made a light bulb go off for the KS stands in the audience who got on me about him basically saying the same thing and called it being realistic. And yeah, KS technically wasn't wrong about that part either. The problem is that we never stop to ask ourselves, well, why are they not completely wrong? Why does society and therefore we base our opinions of others, ourselves, and basically anything else on this kind of arbitrary BS in the first place? Again, patriarchy. Duh. Nigga. Like, that's what I've been saying for like the last two freaking videos. Women like the lady in the clip that I talked about have just accepted the patriarchal structures of what makes men and women valuable, and instead of pushing back against it, have found a way to use their traditional womanhood to access a degree of power within the status quo, even if that access is marginal and again predicated on what society determines what is and isn't desirable. which historically changes just as much as Drake's genre of choice. And men like KS have learned to exploit that same social structure to grift the support of masculinely insecure men. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, so this is my wife. Yeah, I don't know how either. Actually, I do. I'm sexy as hell. That's how. But jokes aside, I think most people aside from, or actually all people aside from the hate watchers, would agree that she fits the standard of conventional attractiveness. She was also childless when we started dating. She was a professional making more money than me even. What I'm saying is, according to Kevin Samuel's logic, she is a high value individual, but she doesn't let that dictate how she views her femininity or her preferences. This despite her coming from a very socially conservative household with both parents, in fact. Now, what's the point of me telling y'all all that and showing y'all her as anything more than just a transparent humble brag? Well, that my wife, according to her own admission, has dated a few dickheads in the past and stayed with them for longer than she should have because she just couldn't handle the idea of being single until she tried it. And don't worry, I had the green light from her to talk about this, so it is what it is. And when she did, it was the happiest that she had been to that point. So much so that when we started dating, she had all but given up on men and just accepted her singleness. Not out of bitterness, but for the betterment of herself. Matter of fact, it was in her singleness that she was finally able to find her true self outside of her capacity to be arm candy. Because again, according to traditional standards of womanhood, a girl like this is not supposed to stay single unless there's something else wrong with her that we're not aware about. See, what a lot, dare I say even most black women have discovered is that they have more than the capacity to live a happy and healthy life absent of a romantic partner or even their ability to elicit one. So a lot of women don't desire a high value man, to be honest. They don't desire a man or a woman for that matter at all. Or at least they're not so desperate enough to sacrifice their self-respect to have one just because society predicates their value upon them having one. And that's the point I want to wrap this longer than it needed to be video on, folks. Okay, so dead white man alert time. Soren Kierkegaard is probably the biggest reason why I'm still a Christian today, aside from church girl coochie, that is. If you know, you know. See, Kierkegaard spent a lot of time talking about the nature of faith and its relationship to the self. But if you want to learn more about that, you can go listen to the Philosophize This podcast episode on him because I'm not wasting time on it. And don't bother reading his stuff. It's more obtuse than that one Family Guy bit. But I want to use Kierkegaard's thoughts on a concept he calls anxiety for this video. Basically, everybody reaches a point in life where they must choose a path toward discovering their true self. The problem is there are so many branching paths toward discovery, and there is no right one. But there are just as many that lead absolutely nowhere. So life is basically like one big David Cage game. And I know most of y'all are not going to get that reference, but just think what Nolan would be if he moonlight working for like Rockstar Studios or something. Yeah, it's that bad. Anyway, the worst part is once you choose a path, you can't start over. I mean, you can branch off, but you can't physically start over because you're not a Time Lord. Thus, we all experience in this moment what Kierkegaard calls anxiety, or better yet, for our purposes of understanding, paralysis by analysis. Let's call it that. The problem is instead of actually choosing a path, many, if not most of us, choose rather to project our sense of self onto an external object, like our occupation, our education, our family. or this is actually the most accurate thing. Now, this all sounds well and good until you sat down and watched Swarm. But what happens if and when that object is taken away from you? What happens when you lose your job and any prospect of ever being able to be in that line of work again? What happens if the child that you built your whole life around being a parent to disowns you and cuts you out of their life completely? What happens if you lose the love of your life in some tragic accident of some sort?
I'm a wreck without you!
And this, folks, is what Kierkegaard calls despair. It's when you lose your mask, basically, and there's no face beneath it because you never bothered to find one in the first place. So what is the point of that brief bit of dead white man musings? Well, going back to what I said about patriarchy going both ways, men in a patriarchal society are conditioned to project our sense of self onto our ability to meet the qualifiers of hegemonic manhood, including our ability to attract conventionally attractive romantic partners. In the same way, women are conditioned to project themselves onto their capacity to attract a traditionally masculine provider, protector, whatever. However, men aren't as readily equipped to break away from our projection because the benefit of us meeting our qualifiers is honestly so much more enticing than for a woman to meet hers. Thus, we're in a perpetual state of either anxiety over losing our self by losing the capacity to perform hegemonic manhood, or despair over our inability to achieve that standard in the first place, or both in a lot of cases. And because, as I said in the last video, men are conditioned to express one emotion and one emotion only, we express our despair through hostility. But not at the framework that conditioned us to be this way, but at the objects within the framework upon which we desire to project our sense of self, if only given the chance to do so. And see, this right here, folks, is how dudes like Kevin Samuels, the Fresh and Fit niggas, and basically every urban podcast host alive have managed to avoid a career in order fulfillment. Hell, if I really want to kick the hornet's nest, is how Patrice O'Neal in the decade following his death has become the patron saint of barbershop niggas now. So much so that his common law widow wrote a whole book about her relationship with him that reads like Think Like a Man as Told by Pygmies. See, outside of Patrice, all of the men I just mentioned are famous for one reason and one reason only. And it's not because of they keeping it real. They knowingly built their audience by publicly humiliating women, knocking them off of their pedestal and right back down to their proper place on the societal totem pole. Basically, it's like the justification behind Greenwood, but with misogyny instead of racism. Okay, yeah, there is a bit of racism there too, if we want to be honest. But why is that? Why is there always such a robust and griftable market for misogynoir when all other avenues fail you? Well, if y'all paid attention to this video or watched the other one I did on the valuation of black women, then you'll know that black and indigenous women occupy the lowest tier on the societal totem pole. Not only are they robbed of autonomy due to their womanhood, but also their humanity due to their coloredness. Thus, women of color, black and indigenous ones especially, are treated not just as commodities, but expendable ones at that. Unlike their fairer-skinned counterparts, society says that they're not even worth preserving. They're basically the red Dixie cups of humankind. They're clutch for a good turn-up, but they're not really worth keeping around once the party is over, unless you're broke. Which kind of makes that whole high value thing way more meta than it has any right to be. Like, Jesus. And now see, folks, this is where things begin to get even more ironic than future sampling Stevie Wonder's Isn't She Lovely at some point in the future, which honestly would be like the funniest thing ever. And for the 30 and unders in the audience, that's a song about the joys of fatherhood, if you didn't know. And, you know, Future is whatever, old man joke. We're moving on here. Western society operates under the illusion of meritocracy. You know, bootstraps, elbow grease, and all that garbage, right? However, because of black women's low valuation in our society and thus their extremely limited access to power in this society, many not only overqualify themselves for general humanity, or I guess you can call it genderless worthiness if you want to think of it that way, but in the process realize that according to that theoretical meritocracy, they have actually surpassed their non-black and non-woman peers. Thus, objectively speaking now, they should occupy the top tier of worthiness. But because, again, black women shouldn't even be capable of such feats to begin with, society still expects them to temper their expectations. Because remember, most of that overqualification was just to make up for their inherent lack of worthiness to begin with. Now, on top of that, none of that has anything to do with societal standards of worthy womanhood. In other words, it don't matter how many degrees you hold or zeros are on your bank statement. You are still judged according to patriarchal standards of what a worthy woman is supposed to be, which, if y'all remember, has little, if anything, to do with breadwinning and education. You're still expected to make yourself as appealing to traditional manhood as possible, even if you don't necessarily want romantic attention from a man, but especially if you do. Even if that means sacrificing your capacity to do hegemonic manhood better than most of the men that you desire attention from. Thus, if they have an off rip, many women choose the autonomy they've earned over the men they could have because, I mean, duh, genius. Now, some of y'all might be saying, but Billiam, what about all of the women who gave up a chance at a degree for multiple baby daddies instead? Why should I have to pay for their bad decision making, huh? Well, again, look at the way that argument is even being framed, smart guy. Almost all the accountability is being placed on the woman in this instance, and not the nigga who knocked her up in the first place. Even when a man's worthiness as a romantic partner is diminished due to single fatherhood, it's not necessarily the fatherhood that diminishes it, but the quality and or quantity of who he chose to become a father with. Baby mama drama and all of that. Those women rightfully believe they should be judged according to the same standard of worthiness as men, and thus when they are not treated as such, they've learned to do the single thing, and more importantly have learned to love it. Again, I'm talking about, you know, the women that y'all call on the carpet for whatever goofy reason. That's the thing, fellas. Black women have, but honestly, that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get at here. Why should you, not as a man, but just as a human being, desire someone who won't extend the same kind of grace that you're willing to offer? Like, why does your supposed desirability have to qualify your worthiness as a human? Like, why really do you want a woman in your life? Is it to complement your pursuit of complete self? Or is that hypothetical woman the presumed final piece of your assumed completeness? Which now brings me back to Kevin and them. See, instead of just saying F the patriarchy altogether, many of us grow angry at women because they've robbed us of our sense of self, or at least that part of our sense of self that is predicated on our desirability. But you don't need romantic partnerships, guys, or even for some of y'all, just the security of knowing that you can have one if and when you want one in order to achieve selfhood. Matter of fact, there's a word for people who think that way. It's called codependent. And it's actually the reason why my first ex blocked my number. No, she didn't actually, but she honestly should have. Now, am I saying you shouldn't want romantic partnerships? No, not at all. Am I saying that you shouldn't be attracted to, or anybody shouldn't be attracted to, traditionally masculine or feminine people? No, I'm not saying that at all. Your preference is your preference. But what I am saying is a person's sense of self-worth ought not be predicated on whether they can, one, pull a romantic partner or not, and two, how closely their personal qualities align with traditional gender identity. And a lot of y'all, frankly, have allowed that frustration to fester into bitterness toward the objects that have robbed you of your sense of self. Women specifically, I'm talking about here. Thus, there is a very, at least teeny tiny corner in the most primordial reptilian portion of your brain that just wants to see these women taken down a peg or two. And that's where people like Kevin Samuels comes in and instigate gender war battles and then profits off the post-battle debris like a Spider-Man villain or the U.S. government. Now, I'm not saying that any of my explanations on what plagues us is universal, because I mean, some niggas are just, that way regardless. But it is me empathizing with guys, much like myself, who did grow bitter based on their apparent inability to be anything more than a dick with a face, which admittedly was fun until it wasn't anymore. There's a difference between singleness based on bitterness and that which is based on betterment. See, I stayed stuck in the former for longer than I'd like to admit. And honestly, if KS had been around like 10 years ago, I'd have taken so many red pills that I would have OD'd on misogyny, to be honest. But once I stopped loathing my singleness and took the time to do some self-reflection instead of finding a tribe to circle jerk my self-pity with, because let's keep it a buck, that's all the manosphere really is, folks. I began to identify all the reasons why a self-respecting woman might not want to give me the time of day. And more importantly, I learned to respect myself enough not to base my self-worth on whether such a woman would want me or not in the first place. I became a better person, not for the sake of a mate, but for the sake of myself. And when I did meet a baddie who valued my supposed or perceived manhood over my humanity, I had enough respect at that point to just say, beat it, chick. And to be frank with y'all, it was the happiest I had been to that point until I met my wife. See, the reason our relationship works is because our valuation of ourselves and each other, for that matter, is independent of what society says it should be. Thus, from jump, we were able to establish both our boundaries and expectations, irrespective of gender roles and what happens if either one of us does cross said boundary. Thus, we can speak freely to each other about things like finances, roles, responsibilities. We even talk openly about people outside of our relationship that we happen to find attractive, sometimes mutually so. Why? What I'm saying is, we work because we love and respect each other's humanity more than we do each other's respective genderhoods. So when I do pay for her to get her nails done, or when she it's not because it's our job, but because it's our choice and thus our pleasure. And to be honest, I feel like everyone deserves, at the very least, the same amount of grace that we give to each other. That and something wrong here. I never said this was a family.